Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Hinds, titled Leave Me Alone. Okay, so Rachel Platen's major label debut album was boring mediocrity, and yet we're still in early January and I need something to talk about. Maybe the indie scene will have something interesting, something with a little bit more fire behind it. Well, in this case, I went straight over to Pitchfork out of pure desperation, and to my surprise, I found a group that I did recognize from a few years back when I was randomly browsing YouTube looking for music. They were a Spanish indie rock garage rock quartet called Hinds. I do remember hearing some of their early singles back when they were still called Deer, and I remember mostly liking a lot of what I had heard. Basically, I described them as a poppier X-Hex by way of the Black Lips, but younger, lighter, more exuberant, and a little bit more scattershot as a result. Sure, it was rough around the edges and kind of disjointed, but at least it was interesting, and I figured that digging into a debut album that dropped a lot later than I would have expected, given the recording was reportedly finished back in the spring, could be pretty fun, I guess. So I checked out Leave Me Alone. Peculiar title for what I thought was a pretty loose and upbeat band, so okay, what did we get? You know, I get the feeling that I should like this album a bit more than I do, because this is a weird little release that I'm not sure holds up as well as it might seem initially. Bizarrely, I kind of wish this album was a little bit more aggressive or punk than it is, perhaps a little bit more straightforward, but I'm not going to deny the messy nature of it all does have a certain charm to it, for only perhaps diminishing returns because of that. So yeah, I actually like Leave Me Alone by Hinds a fair bit, but I feel I should like this a little bit more, and yet when placed against some immediate comparisons, X-Hex, the Black Lips, especially Always, Hinds doesn't always measure up quite as well as I would like, at least for me. And I want to start with the writing on this album for a change of pace, because capturing the lyrical tone of this album is kind of tricky. Like X-Hex, many of these songs focus on complicated, very human relationships and love, but where the guys in many of those situations were painted as manipulative dicks with X-Hex, Hinds goes for a blurrier picture. The best way I can describe it is that it's smart enough to recognize the obvious faults in these guys, drunken, self-absorbed, with douchey friends, and indecisive to boot, and yet the girls still want to seem to have some form of connection, probably more emotionally earnest than they should be given that knowledge. And I'd argue on some level they probably know that too. There's songs like Bamboo and Chili Town where they almost expect the guys to have more of their deal together, if only because Hinds have their own neuroses to deal with and they're looking for support, not more trouble. That makes the X-Hex comparison all the more stark, especially thematically. For as messed up as some of these relationships are, and how in a rational sense it's better to just be rid of them altogether, it doesn't mean that it's not gonna hurdle or get messy along the way, or that they want to be single. They want that loving connection. And yet, they're a more earnest group, so thus we get songs I'll Be Your Man, where they decide to step up, subdue things, and offer to help a little bit, which lets the album closer, Walking Home, hit a surprisingly upbeat payoff as they manage to give and take in this relationship and find some shape of stability, with each supporting the other. I do wish the writing, though, was a little less scattershot and all over the place. Even though I'm fairly certain the most ambitious song, Castigas on el Granero, intends its trapped in a barn scene as extended metaphor, it's also an easy example of how songs can build to one central idea or motif and not really develop it more deeply. Although I would argue that Easy and Chili Town are good exceptions to that rule. They do expand themselves a little bit better. And look, I'm not going to deny that that simplicity fits the musical tone, which is very much driven by our front women. I was initially kind of thrown off by Carlotta Colezos and Anna Perot play off each other pretty well. They can get loud and jarring, and the lo-fi nature of the vocal pickups doesn't take off any of the edges, but ultimately I think it works in their favor, with Colezos playing things a little bit wilder in her higher range, both cooing and shouting, and with Perot's lower tone a little bit more reasoned and measured. That said, the overall wildness of the delivery can feel a little bit overdone for their backing instrumentation, which is all mid-60s pop crossed with the main garage scene, which is why I wish the album opted to play things a little bit faster, a little bit more punk for me. The styles would blend a little better. At least that's what I think. And that's not counting the points where the vocals can just feel a little bit too sloppy. Again, it's lo-fi, you expect this, you would expect it more in punk, but I'm not going to deny that the slurring your lines can get a little bit exasperating. And on that topic, let's go into the instrumentation and production. And honestly, this is the area where I probably have the least to say. Rattling electric guitars that let the strums and melodies sit pretty prominently in the mix and sound pretty damn good, with bass lines and percussion that probably could use a little bit more to do beyond some bare bones arrangements. And that's pretty much the formula for pretty much the entire album. Some faster songs, some slower songs, and yet Hinds do a fair bit to keep things interesting, like giving the bass more prominence to open up Fat Calm Kiddos, at least to a decent chorus and tempo shift, or how the easy coast off a pretty languid vibe before kicking into one of the stickiest melodic hooks on this album. It's a more restrained and I Will Send Your Flowers Back, which subverts its very hippie vibe, especially with the vocal tone, with the frustration in the lyrics lurking underneath it. And while some have complained that Solar Gap, that instrumental interlude, is a lull in the album, I'd argue it's quite essential and one of the better pieces. Not only does it give us a very well-deserved break, it's got one of the better melodies on this album. Hell, I argue when the guitar tone gets a little bit higher and those melodies move closer to the forefront, we get some of the most distinctive and memorable points in this album that I really like. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. I'm not going to deny that some of the less complex grooves can start to blur together a bit in my memory. And it doesn't help that the momentum kind of sputters out in the final quarter of this album, with Walking Home's tempo shifts not really drawing enough to stick a potent landing for me. And look, it's hard not to deny that playing on this record can feel a little bit rough around the edges at points, which is mostly why I wish this record went a little bit harder and faster, a little bit more in that punk direction. If only add more contrast and match our front women a little bit better. I think they would be a great fit in punk if they went in that direction. It honestly plays itself a little bit classier than it should. But in the end though, I like the debut album from Hinds. It's messy, a little bit too earnest for its own damn good. I feel a little bit misshapen at points in its composition, but I'm not gonna deny there's an emotional core and arc and through line to this album that feels authentic and honestly pretty potent. And there are some great melodies on display here. It's not gonna be for everyone. If you're not into this rougher brand of lo-fi garage rock on the indie pop side, this will definitely test a lot of your patience. But for me, I'm thinking a very light 7 out of 10 and definitely a recommendation if you're interested. You know, it might have taken a while after the recording. I'm glad that in the end, Hinds delivered. So check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If you guys got anything that's coming out around this time in January that you want me to cover, yes, I'm going to be covering Bowie, but anything beyond that, please let me know. I'm struggling for material here. And remember, I'm talking about albums in 2016. I'm not talking about 2015 albums. In other words, I'm not talking about Kid Cudi. I have no interest. But until later, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.